Open source is everywhere and it's a fundamental part of our lives. We may use it every single day, but how often do we ask ourselves exactly what it means and what it entails for a piece of software to be open source? I bet quite rarely. Indeed, defining what open source software is and tracking down where it all comes from is quite tricky, and it might get confusing, especially since we frequently hear about software that we can read the source code of in several terms like open source, free software, or source available. Fear not, though, we are going to clear up some of the confusion right away. So when did the open source term originate? To make things very simple, licenses that we currently consider to be open source have to respect the standards decided by an organization called the OSI, which stands for Open Source Initiative. The OSI is a California nonprofit public benefit corporation which has a board of directors and which fundamentally holds the soft power and authority on getting to decide what open source is or is not. As far as whether they owed a legal patent over or any other exclusive use of the word open source and whether it was deserved, there is a lot of discussion going on about this. Officially, the open source campaign was launched in 1998 by a group of people, including Eric S. Raymond, a name that will sound familiar to many when talking about open source. ESR is the author of the popular essay The Cathedral and the Bazaar, a book that to this day is considered one of the most influential and defining pieces of literature that has ever been written about open source software development. Its main topic is comparing the main software development models and open source projects might have. Anyway, this group of people managed to write a document called the Open Source Definition, OSD for short, which serves as a basic standard for what open source should be considered to be. The document was based on the Debian Free Software Guidelines, which existed prior to the OSD. However, they were unable to secure a trademark for the word open source, and there is an open debate on whether the concept of open source was already defined in 1998. From then on, though, things were similar, went anything but smoothly, and the OSI is an institution has faced quite a bit of controversy. The main point of criticism to the OSI is that time and time again is a lack of communication, let's say, to freedom and commitment to freedom. A recent example of this happened in 2020 when OSI co-founder Bruce Perens left the organization over their acceptance of a new license called the Cryptographic Autonomy License that many people believe to violate the basic principles of freedom. About the same time, founding member Eric S. Raymond was completely banished from the organization as a whole, to the point where he was not allowed to subscribe to its mailing list. From time to time, the other pieces of drama about the OSI still surface. A very recent example happened just a few days ago when OSI board candidate Luke Faraone was denied running for OSI board of directors on the basis of a deadline that had not been revealed prior publicly. The episode generated quite a bit of discussion on the fairness of the election process. Anyway, aside from the drama, which is likely too complex to cover in one video, let's get back to the original point. Remember the open source definition I've talked about just a few paragraphs above? To understand what we are talking about, it would probably be a good idea to take a look at what's inside. This is the specification upon which a software license has agreed to be considered open source. After all, it's quite a big deal. So, what exactly is open source? The open source definition deals with defining, in practical and objective terms, what criteria a piece of software needs to satisfy to be called open source in the first place. This document consists of 10 points, which we'll go over. Number 1, free redistribution. To be considered open source, no restriction may be put on how or whether the software is distributed. For example, even though you provide a server from which you obtain a copy of the software and its source code, you may not deny users of your software from making copies of it and sharing it through alternative channels. Then source code. Perhaps the most important part of the definition itself. For a software to be open source, the code files from which it was compiled must be available freely and without limitation on their redistribution. Also, the code must be predisposed of being understandable and modifiable, hence obfuscated code is not allowed. It must also consist of the original source files before going through any compilation phase. Then derived works. It must be possible, for anybody to take the source code and create something else on top of it. The way that derived word is redistributed respects the terms of the license the original work was under. As an example, the GPL license has quite a strict set of rules that a licensed software needs to comply to. When you're making a derived work from one such software, often called a fork, you must ensure that you're not breaking the boundaries of those original rules. Then there's 4, integrity of the author's source code. It is also necessary that credit is given to the original author of the source code. There are cases where derived works must change their name and branding while still giving proper credit to the original authors. 5, no discrimination against persons or groups, which is pretty self-explanatory, actually. 6, no discrimination against fields of endeavor. Perhaps the most important point of the entire document, the software may be allowed to be usable for any and all purposes with no restrictions. This is a point that has been quite controversial and a lot of people wouldn't expect. As an example, if you had a non-commercial clause to your project, which means you dictate that nobody is allowed to make financial profit of your software, then that goes against that. Then technically your software is not published under an OSI compliant license and must not be considered open source. The same would happen if you added a clause as simple as this software may be used for goods and not for evil. While apparently innocuous, a clause like this seeks to limit and dictate what the software can be used for and what not, which can turn into a huge problem with the definition if the definition is lax, which is easily malleable. Technically, a piece of open source software explicitly needs to be usable for any purpose, whether that purpose is making money or using the software or, creating nuclear weapons. 7, distribution of license. The software needs to be distributed with a copy of the license, which people who receive the software need to comply with. 8, the license must not be specific to a product. The software that is licensed must not be forced to be part of any software distribution. 9, license must not restrict other software, which means the license has no say on other software that the program interacts with or is distributed with. And 10, license must be technologically neutral. The license must not depend on any individual technology. So as you can see, the definition is quite strict and it does a good job of ensuring a license that follows has pretty much no way of escaping adhering to the overall spirit of open source. So let's talk about the relationship between open source and free software then. At this point, it would be perfectly understandable to ask oneself, I've heard at length about free software. Is it the same thing? Well, the answer to that question is yes or no. While all free software licenses are also OSI compliant, free software is not quite the same thing as open source software, though some differences tend to be a bit more philosophical. The free software movement is another take on public domain software. It was not invented and led by OSI though, it has been the Free Software Foundation behind it, and it was founded by former MIT professor Richard Stallman. You know the guy. Contrary to open source software, free software as a concept was very much born in academia. Much before the late 90s, public domain software was a thing, though it was more popular in academic circles. Software that fits the definition of being open source and more has been existing since the 50s. At the beginning of computing, sharing the source code behind distributed products was quite the norm. It was only in the 1970s and 1980s that companies such as Microsoft and IBM started to buck this trend, began distributing software without attached source code, and even be openly hostile towards hobbyists who wanted to study their software. This standard quickly took place naturally because it allowed software houses to turn on more and more profits. Well, things continued to go this way until something that is quite funny happened in a lab at MIT. Richard Matthew Stallman, a programmer at the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT, was growing quite frustrated with the new laser printer that had been recently installed in the lab, a Xerox 9700. The older printer that was in use in the lab came with a copy of the source code behind its software, which Stallman had modified to notify users when their jobs were completed and avoid jams. This was very important back in the days. Laser printers weren't quite the relatively small bother desktop units we use today, but they were giant beasts that would stay on another floor in the lab, and that would not be personal, but rather shared between people. The new printer, however, did not come with a copy of the source code, which did not allow Stallman to enhance it with the same modification, hence compromising productivity in the lab. That was the point at which Stallman contacted the manufacturer, explained the issue, and asked for a copy of the source code, which he was denied, because the source code was covered by an NDA and the company was not open to releasing it to its customers. This was an eye-opening moment for Stallman, who, becoming rightfully very frustrated, began to see what was wrong with the new trend of distributing software, and he wanted to do something about it. Shortly after, he founded the non-profit organization that we still refer to today, the Free Software Foundation. What initially came out of the organization were a couple of things. Piece of software that was, first of all, the concept of copyleft, a legal mechanism to make sure a piece of software that was released as free software would have to remain free software through all of its iterations and could never turn proprietary. And an initial license that implements this mechanism, called the General Public License, GPL for short. Although it has gone through several revisions and the version we use nowadays, the GPL version 3 Plus license, is not the same as the original iteration, the core concept behind it and what sets it apart from other licenses is the same. Not only do the 10 points about open source software that we talked about above hold for it, but it also has a viral license. A regular open source license can, and usually does, allow for anyone to create a derivative work from a project, give credits to the original owners, but release the result without also releasing the source code. The GPL fundamentally changes that. If you make a derivative work from a piece of software that is covered by the GPL and you decide to release it, not only do you have to credit the original authors, but you are obligated to disclose to them what improvements you applied to their program, which translates into distributing the software along with a copy of their source code. And this ensures that projects that start on a copyleft license will never turn into copyrighted proprietary programs, because the license simply does not allow that. As you might have guessed, this is already one of the main things that makes free software special. A piece of software that is under a copyleft license, in fact, not only respects all of the 10 points of an OSI compliance one, but more. Free software is fundamentally open source software, but even stronger. The FSF in particular feels strongly about it, and they even strongly maintain that open source movement is off track and free software should be considered the only way to go. The main difference is that, oversimplifying a lot for the sake of brevity, while the open source movement only tries to focus on a practical and objective point of view, the free software movement deeply cares for user freedoms and thought about safeguards to ensure a software that's sort of free stays free. Much like the OSI has its own document, the open source definition, so the FSF has its own free software definition, written by Stallman, and the free software definition, written by Stallman, the free software definition at first glance, where it looks much shorter and more direct than the open source definition. Rather than defining 10 different points, it only defines 4, which are thought to be the 4 freedoms of free software, which were enumerated from 0 to 3 in a way that is reminiscent of how computers actually denote ordinals in memory. So to be considered free software, a piece of software needs to comply with the following 4 freedoms, which I'll cite verbatim below. The freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose, freedom 0. The freedom to study how the program works and change it so it does your computing as you wish, freedom 1. Access the source code is a precondition for this. The freedom to redistribute copies so you can help your neighbor, freedom 2. And the freedom to distribute copies of your modified version to others, freedom 3. By doing this, you can give the whole community a chance to benefit from your changes. Access to the source code, again, is a precondition for this. Another thing that is made clear in the document is how the word free should be denoted. The community has come out with 2 ways to define the possible different meanings of it: free as in beer and free as in freedom. A piece of software that is free as in free beer is available for free and it does not require a payment run, but that is not necessarily a part of free software per se. A piece of software that is free as in freedom or free as in free speech respects the freedom defined by the free software definition. No implication is made on the price. A program may be either or both of these things, but it is not necessary. The FSF explicitly says that it is not necessary that a piece of free software must also be gratis. It is very much possible to require money to use it. Moreover, it is not strictly necessary for the developers to share the source code publicly on some online platform like GitHub or Codeberg. According to the GPL, the important thing is that the source code gets distributed together with the software, and those who obtain the software also receive a copy of the source code. In practice, the opposite rarely happens, and most free software has its own source code available publicly and freely, even in cases where the precompiled binaries are paid for. The benefits of collaboration and the contributions that stem from having the source code available publicly are just too good to pass up. To summarize, no, free software and open source software are not quite the same thing, and those movements are driven by different levels of idealism and different political ideas. While their definitions share a significant amount of overlap, they are very much not the same, and a license that is compliant with the OSI definition is not necessarily also compliant with FSFs. It's a subtle difference, but an important one. The devil is in the details here. Usually we say that a piece of software is licensed under a license that respects both specifications by calling it a piece of FOSS, which stands for Free and Open Source Software. That's what this ubiquitous acronym that you keep hearing about really means. Those insignificant looking details are indeed more critical than they seem. Not so pretty things can happen when they are not observed. So what happens when software does not respect the OSD or the FSD? As of late, there has been a trend of releasing software where the source code is distributed along with the binaries, but is licensed under a custom license that doesn't respect either the OSI or the FSF specifications. These custom licenses are usually more restrictive, and they give the user hard limits on what they can and cannot do with their software. As an example, something that often happens with this is that the user is not allowed to make derivative works from the project, effectively making it proprietary software, putting limits on whether and how the software can be distributed, or making distinction between personal and professional use breaks OSI and FSF definitions. There are many names for these new trends. The more objective name is source available software, a definition that is less strong than open source and simply implies that the source code is readable. And the more opinionated Focus Open Source, the derogatory name that was given to this kind of software because it's typically believed to disguise itself as free and open source code while it isn't. While there is a worrying trend of companies trying to move from open source to source available software to increase profits, so far these companies who had tried it also saw some negative repercussions from it. What ends up happening is that if the software is relevant enough, the community creates a derivative fork, from the latest version of the software that is not encompassed with a new effectively closed source license, and continues development there. A lot of people end up migrating to the new open source fork, especially since major cloud providers like AWS will migrate to that. So leaving open source will backfire for you. As an example, DevOps giant Terraform has recently turned their leading ISC software platform, Terraform, into source available, non-free software, but a lot of its original users have since migrated to OpenTofu as free software alternative that is managed by the Linux Foundation, and that is already adopted by a lot of important companies. Their move has essentially backfired on them. In an attempt to increase profits, HashiCorp ended up losing a lot of users and relevance, especially because OpenTofu is maintained by a committee that has the financial resources and the technical capabilities to keep it running. Something similar happened to Redis, a very popular ORM software, an intermediary software that puts itself between the database and backend code, allowing the latter to interact with the database through a layer of abstraction that simplifies a lot of queries and operations, while decoupling the backend code from database specific programs, thus allowing easier migration. It was not a problem though. Most companies and people who originally relied on Redis moved to Valky, a free and open source fork maintained again by the Linux Foundation. So they are useful, they do something. The same thing happened to the ELK stack by Elastic, a very useful software suite that implements an entire logging, visualization, vector database, and semantic search engine solution. After gaining enough adoption that they abandoned its original Apache license to pursue its custom license, but everyone, including AWS, quickly migrated to their products to the free and open source fork OpenSearch, an Apache license fork of the ELK stack. Just a few months ago, Elastic admitted defeat and relicensed a portion of its code to a free AGPL version 3 license. Sadly, that was a case of too little too late. The damage is done. Most people did not move back to Elastic since the derived fork is as healthy as ever and it's undergoing active development. Where this model has been more successful has been in smaller programs that launch with it from the start. As an example, Git Bootler, a popular front end for Git, which started off as a source available license and has not been replaced by anything yet. So, in conclusion, the world of public domain software can be quite complicated. I hope you have a more complete picture now of what is out there and you truly understand what free and open source software is and why it is so important. By the way, most of the things that are used to do this channel are free and open source, from OBS to the teleprompter I use, because yes, you can notice that I'm using one. So we try our best to go fully open source. Even the website, thelibre.news, links in the video description, where all of these videos are in article format, open source. We value that.